Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar about developments with carbon capture in Eastern Canada, particularly Ontario and Quebec. My name is Carl Jeffrey. I'm publisher of Carbon Capture Journal in London, and our webinar today is sponsored by Decarb Connect. So thank you for that. They organised the Decarb Connect Canada event at the end of October in Toronto. So the Canadian carbon capture story until now has been almost entirely about Alberta and Saskatchewan in the West. But in Eastern Canada, they've been producing natural gas for over 120 years, including from under Lake Erie. So we know there's potential pore space for CO2 storage. And Ontario is advancing the Geologic Carbon Storage Act. But we're hearing about big potential commercial, political, and regulatory challenges. There's also typically thinner and shallower reservoir rock than Alberta. There's going to be lack of political support for carbon pricing and challenges with regulatory support and public awareness. So first today, we're going to hear from Walton. He's Manager Policy and Commercial with the International CCS Knowledge Centre in Saskatchewan. He's going to talk about development of CCS policy in Eastern Canada and how the policy probably needs to evolve. Then we'll hear the perspective from what you might call the sharp end from Wayne Passmore, Technical Manager Business Development with Enbridge Gas. They're a natural gas supplier. He's going to give an overview of their potential project to evaluate CO2 storage in a Cambrian aged saline reservoir in southern Ontario and what we might need from the policy to make it work. And third, we're going to hear from Mathieu Bouchard, Vice President Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs with Deep Sky of Montreal, Quebec. They develop direct air capture projects paid for with high-quality carbon credits, and they're planning CO2 storage projects in Bécancour and Thetford mines in Quebec, including with mineralization. So we're going to have 3 talks of 10 to 15 minutes. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time and say who the question is for, but we'll take them at the end. And I'd like to invite Mac to start his talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. That works. All right, everybody. I'm Mac Walton. I'm the Manager of Policy and Commercial, as Carl mentioned, at the International CCS Knowledge Center. The International CCS Knowledge Center, based out of Regina, has been sharing the lessons learned from the Boundary Dam capture facility for about the last 10 years, operation, maintenance, as well as working to achieve our other mission, which is accelerating the development of CCUS projects in Canada and abroad. This presentation, I'm going to be taking a bit of more of a high-level view quickly over generally where we're at for carbon management projects in Canada and what it takes really to support their development, which is relevant for both Ontario and Quebec as they develop their regulatory frameworks and the rest of Canada, quite frankly, as well. So I'll just start with just kind of an overview of the different carbon management projects. When we talk about carbon management, it is carbon capture, transportation, storage, CDR type projects that involve geological storage. To date, there has been over 20 megatons of CO2 captured, as well as 55 megatons stored primarily in Western Canada. The difference between those two is actually CO2 that was captured in the States and transported into southern Saskatchewan for sequestration. Canada has, as you can see, there's a large number of projects being developed, primarily in Western Canada, but with a growing number of projects in Eastern Canada, and as regulatory frameworks are developed and an economic pathway is created. So the main topic that I'm talking about here is what enables carbon management. There are some really important prerequisites to being able to do carbon capture and storage. First, you have to have proven carbon storage, places to put the CO2 once it's captured. Additionally, because you are dealing with a whole bunch of different regulatory areas, subsurface pipelines often, industrial facilities, strong regulatory frameworks are critical for the success of those projects. These are large financial investments often, and financial support is typically necessary as we're solving a public challenge, which is climate change. carbon capture can be very expensive. So innovation ecosystems that help to reduce and optimize operations and reduce costs are really important, as well as making sure that there's a workforce and supply chain to be able to make these things happen. Alongside all of this, there also needs to be public support and corporate buy-in. People need to want carbon capture to happen, as well as companies need to want to reduce their emissions for CCS projects to move forward. For the rest of this quick presentation, I'm going to focus on proven carbon storage and strong regulatory frameworks, because I think it's the most relevant to where we're at in Ontario and Quebec. So Canada has tremendous natural resources, and carbon storage is one of those. The map shows here on the slide primarily where carbon storage potential is. It is much more proven and evaluated in Western Canada in the Western Sedimentary Basin through multiple layers deep below the surface, with about 5 or so dedicated geological storage projects and 5 or so enhanced oil recovery with CO2 injection storage sites as well. These projects can store megaton scale CO2, but really it is critical to know that it's safe, and that the CO2 will stay underground when you're injecting. So making sure that it's both available and proven is really important. Mineralization, as I think Mathieu will be talking about later, is also another big potential for Canada, particularly in regions where the subsurface is not sedimentary basins. This is something that could happen in regions of Canada that are rocks and trees. Developing and managing the pore space is also a very important consideration. There's different approaches that people take towards doing so. Alberta, for example, has a double pathway where they're both developing carbon storage hubs to take in large amount of CO2 from multiple sources, as well as small scale and remote capture projects in areas that are further away. Making sure that there's access to these and types of storage opportunities is really important. Again, data and research and development are needed for both Central and Eastern Canada, as well as for mineralization across Canada, and primarily Ontario, BC, and Quebec. Canada also has unique comparative cost advantages. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but because of our large amount of carbon storage, particularly in Western Canada, you can capture close to storage. A lot of other places developing CCS are doing offshore carbon storage, particularly in Europe, which, I mean, drilling injection wells offshore can be about 5 times more expensive than it is onshore, which is an automatic advantage for Canadian carbon storage projects. Built infrastructure increases access and cost. We have about 15 megatons of CO2 pipelines that have of excess capacity in Western Canada, particularly in the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line in southeastern Saskatchewan. And there's also consideration that we need to treat pore space like a finite public resource, which it is, as a way to help us decarbonize. I think that there's been some recent articles like Nature that have really made that clear to folks as well. Strong regulatory frameworks. So when I talk about regulatory frameworks, I'm talking about carbon storage regulatory frameworks. So what is available to help put CO2 underground? What are the rules that companies need to follow? Those types of things. And really, there's kind of 6 principles that we look at in terms of building a strong regulatory framework. First, and most importantly, they're created to protect the environment and ensure public safety. They need to make sure that there is access to the pore space for projects that need it. The permitting process needs to be efficient. CO2 storage is forever, so it is much different than other, I'd say, subsurface resources where you're extracting resources from the subsurface, where the liabilities for this and putting CO2 underground is long term. So managing those aspects are very important and different for CCS. And as well as it verifies that the private sector, which does a lot of risk mitigation, but it verifies for the public that those mitigations are happening. And a strong public regulatory framework that is independent builds public trust in these projects, which is critical for their success. Across Canada, as mentioned before, Western Canada has well-developed carbon storage frameworks, primarily due to the fact that that's where most of the oil and gas development has happened, and there's been disposal wells and EOR happening for almost 30 to 40 years in Western Canada. So this is something that is less new. In Central and Eastern Canada, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec have been developing a large number of acts and regulations to make these things happen. On offshore and in Atlantic Canada, often this will require both the federal government and provincial governments working in lockstep to build policies when we're talking about doing things on the coast. A critical area that I just wanted to provide a bit background for folks is related to pore space. There are different ways that groups approach pore space, particularly onshore storage. You're dealing with mineral rights, surface rights, as things that are property rights for individuals or organizations that have been longstanding. These are pore space, as in where CO2 is injected in the subsurface, is different than really minerals, as it is the void in the space between. So there's different approaches that governments have taken to determine what pore space is from a legal perspective. Places like Alberta, Manitoba, and BC have basically said that pore space is in the right of the Crown, otherwise known as is a public resource that is separate from mineral ownership. Other jurisdictions have determined that it is part of the mineral rights. Lots of the states have determined that it's part of the surface rights holders. A lot of this has to do with historic precedent on a whole bunch of different legal aspects and how resources are developed in the past. For this discussion, Ontario, in their regulatory proposals and through the Geologic Storage Act, has determined that it is primarily in the rights of surface owners. However, there are certain circumstances whereby the Crown can take, I essentially say that they own the pore space itself. Permitting processes. I'm going to go move quickly so we can listen to everybody else. But a big thing is that in the States, particularly, the time length of Class 6 wells is a major issue. It can take multiple years. That hasn't necessarily been the case in Western Canada, and it's very important that that isn't the case in Eastern Canada as it gets developed. Long-term liability, as I mentioned before, there's really three types of long-term liability for carbon storage. There's statutory obligations, as in monitoring, measurement, and verification of the CO2 in the subsurface is something that needs to happen ongoing. Knowing where the CO2 is really important, as well as just general tort liability. So if there were to be any reversals, things like that, if there's any harms, economic or physical, to different aspects of that, again, or one thing I will just add is that over the course of the past 50 years from geological storage sites, there's been no examples of CO2 that's reached the surface. So the risk is generally low, but is still an important consideration for regulatory frameworks. As well as if you're generating any credits from injecting the CO2, there's some financial liability that can occur that needs to be dealt with as well. Some jurisdictions have long-term liability transfers whereby that liability can be transferred to the Crown. Alberta carbon storage hubs have this ability to transfer the statutory tort and ownership, as well as a release of credit liability if you follow the rules of their regulatory framework to a T. Some provinces don't have this process in place. Others are looking at it, like BC and Saskatchewan. Ontario has indicated that that's something that they would move forward with as well. And finally, maybe I'll go one more slide after this, is building public trust. Again, there are 55 megatons of storage sites 2,000 kilometers of CO2 pipeline, a lot of that having to do with back and forth around EOR projects. We haven't had major issues in Canada. And part of that is due to the regulatory frameworks that we do have in place. It's also important that projects are looking to build partners with the communities and stakeholders rather than just getting permission as well. The last thing I will just go through quickly is just the importance of financial supports in all of this. The economics for CCS projects, they are essentially waste management projects. These are not necessarily financial winners. And so having the different mechanisms in place to enable projects to make these investments is critical. A big part of this has to do with, in Canada, the large emitter carbon pricing systems that are in place. Western Canada, particularly Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan, developed quantification protocols to allow for CCS projects to develop credits. There's some changes to those systems that I'm not going to spend too much time, but if you guys are ever interested, feel free to reach out to the Knowledge Center to discuss. That will change essentially the way that these projects are financed. Ontario and Quebec don't necessarily have this pathway. Quebec's counterpart on a carbon pricing, the ETS partnership with California. California's clean fuel standard and has a process for CCS verification and storage that allows people to generate credits in the low carbon fuel standard, but there's none specific to Quebec itself. And yeah, so I think with that, I think we should hear from people who are less theoretical and more doing things. So I'll turn it back to Carl to pass it over to other people. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Okay, so now we're going to go 2,000 kilometers to the east and hear from Wayne Passmore, who's the manager of business development with Enbridge Gas, who's going to tell you how close we are to making this all work. So pass over to Wayne, cheers.
Super. Thank you, Carl and Mac, for that nice introduction, laying out the scope of what's going on across Canada, and in particular, what's necessary for this to move forward here. Here in Ontario, we have a long history of oil and natural gas production. In fact, North America's first commercial oil well was discovered near here, what is now known as Oil Springs, Ontario, in 1858. Of course, our production peaked many years ago, and today we produce less than 1% of what we consume as a province. That said, though, Ontario does sit, as you saw on Mac's map there, on the edge of two geological basins that have potential suitable pore space and sedimentary rock that could support CO2 storage in saline aquifer reservoirs. There's not a lot in the public domain about that potential here in Ontario, but there's an old 2007 Ministry of Natural Resources report that suggests that Ontario could have up to 730 million tons of CO2 storage capacity in a Cambrian age regional saline aquifer in southwestern Ontario. So while CCS may be possible in Ontario, our geology is yet to really be proven to determine the actual amount of usable pore space for CCS here. For context, Ontario, with its industrial point source emissions of about 44 million tons per year, is about 1/3 the size of Alberta. But Alberta has over 100 times the potential pore space at a little over 78 million tons. So here in Ontario, we really only have one chance to get it right. That map that Mac showed many projects across a very broad area. The aerial extent of what we've got here is much, much smaller, probably only room for, 2 or 3, maybe 4 projects like the scale of what you're seeing out there. And as we like to point out to people here in Ontario who have never heard of CCS before, CCS is not new. It's just new to Ontario. Western Canada, of course, has been doing it for decades, as you heard from Mac. In fact, recently, Enbridge, while we were advancing our Walton carbon storage project in Alberta, we became interested in trying to explore the potential to do it here in Ontario. So we partnered up with Imperial Oil to evaluate southwestern Ontario. We acquired some 2D seismic in the Haldimand County area back in June of 2024, and we applied for and were awarded special project status by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources in July of 2024. And we were looking to drill up to 2 evaluation wells to test the technical feasibility of the reservoir and the caprock. In fact, we entered into a $5 million Natural Resources Canada contribution agreement, which was going to help fund this thing. And of course, the way they work, you get some of that back after you've made those investments. However, the Ontario government here is proceeding slowly to implement the regulatory framework that we saw previously was so critical to success. And the proposed Geologic Carbon Storage Act that was introduced in November of 2024 died on the floor of the legislature in January of 25 with an early Ontario election. It was reintroduced in May of 2025. And while the proposed act attempts to set up a framework for CCS to move forward in Ontario, it has a number of shortcomings that are likely to drive up costs and make commercial CCS a little less viable and a little less likely here in Ontario. Some specific examples include the pore space, and you saw on Mac's slide there that the Western Canada has taken control of all the pore space. Ontario has elected to leave that with the landowners. And this, of course, as you saw, comparing it to other jurisdictions, is very much an American approach where property rights are constitutionally protected, unlike in Canada. And this means higher pore space costs on private land. They have chosen to make some crown land available, but it's all underwater, largely under Lake Erie and potentially Lake Huron, which will be much more expensive to drill and lay pipe on. And hidden in the details there is also one of the requirements for a project to get approval is that the local municipality must actually pass a support resolution at their local council, effectively giving municipalities a veto. This is very similar to wind and solar projects in Ontario, but it's a little puzzling as to why we need that for something that's underground and largely out of sight. So this just adds more costs and potentially more political uncertainty. Now, Ontario is currently in the midst of its 7th public consultation process on regulations for the proposed implementation of CCS here in Ontario. Comments are in fact due next week on September 26th. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, you should. And before I get into the details of some of those regulations, we here at Enbridge feel that the goals, the higher level goals of the legislation and the regulations should be to enable and support the timely development of commercial CCS here in Ontario for as many large emitters in the province as possible, while of course ensuring public safety. And there should be no unnecessary or arbitrary restrictions on CCS development. Science should rule the day. Keep CCS costs low to help Ontario businesses be competitive to other jurisdictions. Maximize and optimize the use of all potential pore space in Ontario. Reduce the red tape by streamlining the approvals process. Take a whole of government approach and look at the whole project and everything that has to move forward in order for the thing to actually get built and in place. And unfortunately, some of the details in the proposed regulations package are not exactly supporting all of these goals. Specifically, the government does not appear to really want to maximize this potential. They're taking what they call a very staged approach. Let's try this, and if that works, maybe we'll expand it. And of course, our view is that we should be trying to open this up right from the beginning. So some examples of how this is showing up in the proposal is that, private pore space probably represents about 1/3 of the pore space. Probably 2/3 of it is under the Great Lakes, which is already controlled by the Crown. So that kind of makes it questionable as to how they're going to get the 1/3 that's under private land. They are proposing to follow Alberta's model with a request for proposals for the public's pore space. So that's good. But of course, it's only going to cover 2/3 of the pore space. If you are trying to do a project onshore, you're going to need to get 70% of the pore space owners signed up before you can leverage what's known in Ontario as a unitization process. That sets a pretty high threshold. And it's going to result in different pore space acquisition processes for public and private land. And of course, some of the best pore space is right along the private land that's right along the shore of Lake Erie. And so there's going to be a bit of a debate about how we actually manage that pore space, where you could have a well onshore that's influencing pore space offshore or vice versa. So while we see, and they also have added a vesting provision, Mac made a brief allusion to that there is still an option for the province to claim and manage pore space on private land. That can only happen if you've already got some public land. So we welcome that there's a process there, but exactly how that's going to work is yet to be seen. And it does require that you will likely have to have a very large emitter as part of your project. And it will also end up being a political decision that will go before the Premier's cabinet here in Ontario. So this, again, creates more political uncertainty. And what this is likely to do is to push CCS in Ontario offshore. And as Mac mentioned, drive up costs, 4 or 5 times more than it might have been if we were able to do this onshore and have the government follow Alberta's process and invest all of the pore space. We're also seeing a bit of regulatory complexity. as we go through this. The government of Ontario has, we feel, really missed an opportunity to take this whole of government approach, because multiple approvals are going to be required to move a project forward. We're going to need the Ministry of Natural Resources to approve a storage project. We're going to need the MECP for the carbon capture side of it. There's still no clarity around how we're going to regulate CO2 pipelines here in the province. The Ministry of Natural Resources has chosen to exclude that from the Geologic Carbon Storage Act, leaving a bit of a question mark around there. And of course, as Enbridge, as a pipeline company, we're quite curious to see how we're going to unfold that. If we are putting CO2 underground on Crown land, the Mining Act of Ontario needs to be amended yet. And this municipal veto option, of course, introduces what we would feel potentially is a disproportionate level of decision-making relative to the working interests that the municipalities are likely to have. We're going to need hundreds, if not thousands, of landowners to get leases before we can even propose a project area for evaluation, let alone move it to the actual commercial storage operation. So in summary, while we are encouraged to see a potential path forward for commercial CCS in Ontario, the current path that we were on will likely see us with higher costs, much longer timelines than competing jurisdictions, and therefore a reduced probability of commercial success. I look forward to your questions and the ensuing discussion. Back over to you, Carl. And I think I'm just a hair under my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much, Wayne. That's great. So now we'll go another 1,000 kilometers east to Montreal. We're going to hear from Mathieu Bouchard, who's got some very interesting projects with direct air capture and mineralization. So let's hear from Mathieu. Cheers.
Yes, thank you, Carl. Very happy to be here today and talk about the potential for carbon storage, permanent carbon storage in Quebec. As Carl mentioned, I'm with Deep Sky. We are a carbon removal company based here in Montreal with a focus on direct air capture and geological storage. We actually launched our first project or switched on the lights at the first project in Alberta, in Innisfil, about an hour north of Calgary. A few weeks ago, it is now capturing carbon with a number of technologies. We're tech agnostic, so we select the best technologies that are available in the market in terms of direct air capture, and then we deploy them. That's what we're doing in Innisfil at Alpha, that we call in Innisfil, Alberta. And we're hoping we're the first ones actually to be capturing carbon and permanently storing it in North America. So my focus in my job is on Quebec, and as I'm about to get into, there's a lot of developments in Quebec and some pretty exciting opportunities here. So Quebec, in terms of geology, and full disclosure, I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm not a geologist, but I've learned a lot in the last year since I've joined Deep Sky, and I'll try to be as clear as possible, but don't hesitate if you have any questions. So in terms of geology in Quebec, we have two opportunities. There's sedimentation with deep saline aquifers in the St. Lawrence lowlands, so along the St. Lawrence River. But there's also an emerging opportunity which we're actually pursuing with mineralization in mafic and ultramafic rocks. So I'll touch quickly on the sedimentation. There's potential in the Bécancour. If you know Quebec, the Bécancour area, it's about halfway between Quebec City and Montreal, just south of the St. Lawrence River, across the river from Trois-Rivières. There's about 120 million tons of potential in saline aquifers there. And we've actually, Deep Sky has undertaken what is the largest geological study east of Manitoba in the history of Canada. And so we deployed that last year. So in the summer and fall of 2024, we've collected very, very large amount of data that's currently being analyzed by the Institut National de Recherche Scientifique, which is a research university here in Quebec we've partnered with. And we're hoping to get data or a conclusive analysis by spring 2026. So more to come in this, but there's real potential in that deep saline aquifer. It's about 2.5 to 3 kilometers underground in the St. Lawrence lowland. So that's sedimentation. Now, the other opportunity we have in Quebec, and it's probably a bigger one as well, is mineralization. So as some of you may know, there's a natural chemical reaction that happens when you mix water and carbon, you create an acid. And when it interacts with some types of rocks that are rich in magnesium or iron, it turns into a carbonate. So there is that type of rock. There's plenty of it across Quebec, both in the Appalachians and the Canadian Shields. And that's what we're looking into. And the first site that we're exploring is located in Thetford Mines. For some of you may remember Thetford Mines as the asbestos capital of the world, which it was for about 150 years now. All the asbestos mines are closed, and you end up with this kind of lunar landscape with a lot of exposed rocks and old mine tailings. But it also means that it's been explored and researched for decades by mining companies, and we have a very, very good sense of what's underground, what's in there. And that includes ultramafic rock, so rock that's extremely rich in magnesium, same rock that used to contain, or that contains the asbestos, but that we're not touching, of course. And that rock, as I said, naturally reacts with that mixture of water and carbon to make a magnesium carbonate. So when you go in the area, if you go to Thetford Mines and you look at the tailings, they're all covered with kind of a whitish, greenish powder. It's not a powder because it's actually very firm. It sticks to those rocks, but that is the natural phenomenon that we're trying to replicate. That is the magnesium carbonate, and that's the phenomenon that will replicate a few hundred meters below ground. And I say a few hundred meters, it's because contrary to deep saline aquifers that are a few kilometers underground, in this case, we're injecting the mixture of water and carbon directly into the bedrock. And so we don't need to go as deep. We just need to be well below the water table in order not to have any impact on that. But we don't need to be as deep as in the case of saline aquifer, because we're using the bedrock itself as the material in which we're injecting the carbon and turning it into a very stable mineral. That mineral, that magnesium carbonate, doesn't react with anything, doesn't react with water. Once it turns into a carbonate, it is there for thousands, if not millions of years. And so we've started this study on site in Thetford Mines. We've collected some rock samples, and in that case, we're collaborating with Queen's University in Kingston. So those samples have been in the lab at Queen's, and we've been circulating a mixture of carbon and water in the lab with the rock. And the results, the preliminary results, or the lab results that we got, was that 70% of the carbon turns into a carbonate within 3 months, and then the balance of it, all of it, in less than a year. Now, if you compare to other mineralization projects across the world, there was one Oman, and then there's one that's operating right now in Iceland with Carbfix. The balsamic rock that they're injecting it into takes about 2 years to convert all of the carbon that's injected into a carbonate. So we're basically doing it at twice the speed that's happening right now in Iceland. Now, we're hoping that these lab results will also materialize in the real world, and that's why we're moving ahead this fall in the next few weeks with drilling a first test well that will go down to between 800 and 1,000 meters, and that will allow us to hopefully confirm these lab results and prove that there's this amazing mineralization potential right here in Quebec in the Thetford Mines area. If that turns out, if those same results that we got in the lab prove to be the same in the actual bedrock, we're looking at a capacity for that area of about 30 gigatons of carbon storage space. But if you extrapolate that and look across Quebec, we're basically looking at the same capacity as the Canadian prairies, so the 3 provinces combined. And then you could turn to Nova Scotia, that has potential in those types of rocks, as well as Ontario, the Canadian Shield in Ontario. So that's all moving. That's the scientific part. If it all works out, we are planning to develop a 500,000, so 500,000 ton direct air capture facility right there in Thetford Mines. We're working very closely with the community. We've had many engagement sessions. We've held an open house back in February. There's lots of support. As you can imagine, the community sees this as a great way of rehabilitating old mining sites that have been left or that have been unused for a couple of decades now. So it's a great economic opportunity and environmental opportunity for the community. Lots of support as well from the government of Quebec, which brings me to the next point, which is the framework. So Quebec doesn't have a framework yet, doesn't have legislation or regulation that governs carbon storage, geological carbon storage, but that's in the works. The government has been drafting legislation for the last 2 years. They've been extremely dutiful in looking at models that exist right now. What we're told, so we haven't seen the legislation yet, but what we're told is that they based it on the best out of the Alberta model, learning as well from what Manitoba did, their legislation that they got completed last year, and some probably of the mistakes that they didn't want to repeat. They've also been working very closely with ECCC at the federal level. As some of you may know, one of the key benefits of having a legislation is opening the door to the very generous carbon storage and utilization tax credit that's available at the federal level for direct air capture. We're talking about a 60% refundable tax credit on the direct air capture equipment and a 37.5% tax credit, again, refundable on storage. So for a company like us, that sells credits on the voluntary markets, we absolutely need those tax credits at this time while we're still scaling up the technology and improving it. We need it if we want to make this economical. So we need to be operating in jurisdictions that have that tax credit now, or that have those frameworks. And another benefit in the case of Quebec is that we have access to clean power. So as a lot of you will know, the power grid in Quebec is mostly fed hydroelectric electricity, and as well as some wind. And so it is 98%, over 98% clean, which means that we can use it to do direct air capture without having to develop behind the meter renewable energy projects. Now, in terms of what we know on the legislation, they seem to really have learned, as I said, lessons from other jurisdictions. In Quebec, all mineral rights are Crown property. That's in our Mining Act, and they want to replicate that model for pore space, whether it's for sedimentation or mineralization. So all of the potential pore space in the province will be Crown owned by law, meaning that you get your license to operate a storage facility from the government. Now, of course, you have to negotiate access to the surface, to the land with the landowner and the surface, but the landowners do not own the pore space underneath their property the same way they don't own any of the minerals that can be mined there. Number two, they're going to have a robust environmental impact assessment process. Any one of you who's ever looked at Quebec, we probably have one of the most robust systems in Canada, and it includes public hearings. We're welcoming this because we think, and as I mentioned before, we're already engaged in the communities where we want to operate, and we think it's very important to have an opportunity to present our projects to the public and to get the social license. Last but not least, in terms of long-term liability, they will follow the Alberta model, where after a set period of time of monitoring, once a well has been closed, that the long-term liability reverts back to the Crown, as opposed to remaining with the promoter. Now, the good thing is that they're completely agnostic in terms of the storage method, storage technology. So we'll be allowed to do both mineralization and sedimentation under this framework. It's also tech-agnostic in terms of the way you capture the carbon. So it could be point source capture, it could be direct air capture, and we're actually looking at partnering up with others to combine direct air capture with point source capture when there's extra space available. So bringing carbon that's been captured at large industrial facilities to our storage and then sell that storage space to these large emitters who would want to reduce their emissions. So we'll see once we actually have a piece of legislation. It's in terms of timing, they've promised, and I had conversations just this morning before this call, supposed to be introduced this fall with the new session, and it is a priority for this government. As some of you may know, they have 1 year left. We'll be in a general election a year from now, but they've told us many times that the legislation and the regulation will be in place by the spring of 2026 so that we can move forward with our projects and we can get the power that we need to have a first facility here in Quebec. So happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mathieu. So I'd like to invite Mac and Wayne, if you'd like to turn your cameras on, and we'll go to the Q&A session. So if you want to put your questions in, you can upvote the questions so we can see which ones people are most interested in. I'll see there's a lot of questions about monitoring, and some of them look quite skeptical. I was thinking I haven't changed anybody's mind about carbon capture in my life until now. So if people are skeptical, you're probably going to be skeptical at the end of the hour, whatever we do. But I guess we'll start. We've got one upvote. Victoria Hun has a question. She's on her LinkedIn. She's a consultant geologist at Geoenergy Durham in this side of the pond. What's the time scale of the mineralization to Mathieu? Do you want to start with that one?
So the time scale of the
time scale of that. How long does it take to mineralize? I think it's.
So yes, as I said, currently what we've seen in the lab is that it's 3 months for 70% of the carbon to mineralize, and then the balance of it, the remaining 30%, will mineralize within 1 year. So in a year, all of it is mineralized.
Wow, that's a lot of magnesium. That's a yeah, very good. So Arjun Brem is a structural geology consultant in Cantata, Ontario, according to his LinkedIn. So he'd like to ask Wayne about concern about water going into aquifers. We have lots of CO2 going into aquifers. We have lots of CO2 in aquifers over here, and there isn't much concern, but they're not using it for drinking water. But I guess is that an easy question to answer, or is it a?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Yeah, the aquifer that we're looking to target in Ontario is about 1 kilometer down versus 3 kilometers in Alberta. So it's definitely a little shallower here in Ontario, but it is a saline aquifer, meaning it's naturally occurring salt water that's at depth. And in fact, to get to it, you've got to go, the drinking water is up top. There's actually a bunch of geological formations, including one that has water that's often very rich in sulfur, and then some more layers, and then ultimately we get into several layers of salt water in naturally occurring saline water in the reservoir. So we're looking to go to the very lowest one that sits right on top of the Precambrian shield. Kind of while I have the floor, Carl, I'll try to answer one of the other questions I see there. Look, and it really has to do with, the dip. And of course, as I mentioned, Ontario's at the edge of the basins. So they kind of dip down as you go northwest away from Ontario. And of course, they dip to the south across Lake Erie. And so there very much is a modeling that's going on to look at it, where we're going to put CO2 in a well, it's going to radiate outwards, radially, but the local geology will also affect that. And so if there's a bit of dip there, it will tend to dip, or it will tend to move up dip. And that's a reality of the models. We'll have to look at it. So it's all part of modeling the whole thing, and then going forward to prove to the government that you've modeled this in a way that meets all the requirements, follows the Z741 codes and all the other regulations that are there to convince them to get you a storage license. So.
Yeah, well, Wayne, you told me before we started you've been doing this for 36 years, so you must have.
I've been working at the natural gas company here in southwestern Ontario for 36 years, and I started my career in underground natural gas storage. And of course, there we, put gas in the ground, for a few months and then pull it back out. So we feel we've got the experience in putting stuff underground, knowing where it is, and getting it all back. The big difference, of course, with CCS is we're going to try to put it in the ground and make sure it stays there. So, so there's definitely some common experiences there for sure.
Oh, very good. So should we go to Mathieu? This question from Arjun Brem. He'd like to ask you about earthquakes.
Yes,
There's a little to no room to
earthquakes,
grow.
so naturally occurring earthquakes in Montreal and the St. Lawrence region. And yes, the answer to your question is yes, we are definitely seized of this. It is part of the analysis that's being conducted right now by our partners at INRS. And it will be part of one of the one of the very, very key factors as to whether or not we can move ahead, because we do not want to trigger earthquakes by injecting carbon into a saline aquifer. So if the answer is the risk is too high, then we're not going to do it. But we're analyzing this. I know they're modeling all the fault lines in the area and trying to see how would the geology or the geology react if we start injecting additional fluid. And same answer for Thetford mines. We've deployed the seismic monitors on the ground in Thetford. They were deployed a few weeks ago so that we have a baseline in terms of seismic activity before we start anything. As you can understand, this is an area that's been extensively mined. So there are mine shafts, holes everywhere, and there's an existing seismic activity, human-induced seismic activity that's happening right now, and that's what we want to see in terms of that's the baseline we want to establish, so that we know that once we start injecting, and again, we'll be extremely prudent because we're very much aware of that risk. When we start injecting, it will be extremely small quantities of water and carbon, and then we'll build very, very slowly to see how the rock reacts and if there is any additional seismic activity that's induced, and if so, at what level. I mean, we're expecting that there'll be some small movements, but the idea is to keep it at extremely low levels.
Well, very good. I'll just remind everyone, if you want to use the upvote button, clicking up that thumbs up. Oh, sorry, Wayne.
I was just going to add, while we're talking about seismic activity, it is something that the Z741, the Geologic Carbon Storage Regulations, for CSA, is very explicit about seismic monitoring, and the proposed regulations for the Ontario said they're going to follow Z741 and any successors that come to it, perhaps an ISO standard down the road. But in there, it's very explicit that you've got to do this monitoring, and similar to what Mathieu said, Enbridge is very risk averse. We are not going to do anything that's unsafe, right? So if we can't do it safely, we're simply not going to do it. And part of that, of course, is putting up a passive seismic monitoring array well in advance of any injections to establish that baseline. I think the proposed regulations stipulate 12 months, and that's probably, longer is probably better to see what is actually happening in that area before you get started. It's something that we're aware of and need to be modeling and monitoring actively.
Oh, very good. We've got 2 upvotes for Victoria's question. I don't know why this is. What's the salinity of I don't know what SA is in Ontario? Must be
Of the saline aquifers.
Saline aquifer. Yeah.
That's one of the things we're looking to test, and my understanding is it's largely saturated. But that's the geochemistry of the water in the aquifer is an important part of the evaluation. So getting those samples and doing those analysis so that you can model it is very critical to how the CO2 will get dissolved or absorbed into the actual reservoir. So we have some samples, but not a lot. So we're at that stage now where we're cautiously optimistic and think we need to do some evaluation wells to get some of this key data, that will help inform this. A lot of the wells to date have all been about natural gas production, and not necessarily looking at things like geochemistry of the salt water, so different kinds of testing when we're looking to do CCS. And just with some of these regulatory, challenges, carbon policy uncertainty in Canada that Mac talked about, Enbridge is looking to do this for our large emitter customers. They've asked for our help, and with a lot of the political uncertainty that we see right now, the tariffs, all these kinds of things, generally creating a bit of a pause and think and wait moment for a lot of industry. And, and that on top of some of the regulatory challenges that I discussed, just said Ontario is just gonna kind of take the foot off the gas a little bit here and see how things shake out before we really start seeing major significant capital investments for industrial scale CCS here in Ontario.
Oh, there's one question for Mac here. I don't want you to give you other discussion. So Richard Jones from Durham is asking how many of the regulatory frameworks are coordinated at national level rather than within each province.
Yeah, and I don't feel bad for being left out. They have more interesting things to talk about. But the regulatory frameworks are provincial jurisdiction. The subsurface is provincial jurisdiction primarily. Probably the closest thing to coordinating this has to do with what are called designated jurisdictions, and it was mentioned by Wayne and Mathieu, and the CCS investment tax credit has designated jurisdictions, and only those provinces are able to access the investment tax credit for CCS. So ECCC has a role in determining and has a process, and it's not necessarily public, of identifying which provinces have sufficient regulatory frameworks from their perspective to be considered eligible for the ITC. There are other aspects too, where that jurisdiction is also type of role is also used. So the Clean Fuel Regulations Quantification Protocol also has designated jurisdictions, and it's the same provinces that are in the CCS ITC. And so it's kind of less of a coordination. I guess the other thing is that all of the provinces and the federal government do evaluations to make sure that CO2 and credits that are generated are well monitored, verified, all of those different things. And they absolutely cheat off each other's homework. They're constantly looking at what the other provinces and federal government are doing. And so this is kind of like a precedent thing as well in terms of just borrowing and copying, I suppose.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, Mac, carbon pricing policy, right, is largely set federally too, right? And that's an important part of why some of these folks are looking at this. And then the other thing that's kind of a national kind of perspective is looking at things like carbon contracts for differences that are being competed at, to help stabilize and make these carbon credit a little more bankable to help FIDs.
Yeah, it's not, I agree. And it's not much different than a lot of things where the federal government has larger money bags that are involved, and that impacts how things work. So.
Well, very good. So Dan has a question for Mathieu. So Dan is this side of the water again, principal numerical modeler at WSP in Wales. He'd like to ask, are in situ fracture networks consideration for the viability of the project? Is that something you've looked at, the fracture networks?
Yes, because the bedrock in Thetford is actually is not porous at all. It is extremely dense. And what we're banking on are the natural fractures within that bedrock to allow for the water to circulate and eventually to mineralize. So we are 100% using those natural fractures within the rock to ensure that there is mineralization, and we're tracking them. We did a modeling of through aerial photography or deep penetration radar, I think it's called, to get a good, we have a good 3D picture of the rock, and we'll be following those fault lines.
Well, and Mathieu, do you want to take Catherine's question? So she's a research engineer at Natural Resources Canada in Ottawa. So she's asking about, can you do it ex situ? That means doing it in the ground.
So we actually looked at it. We looked at it a couple of years ago. We had explored a partnership with a company that does ex situ mineralization. What we concluded is that the potential is just not high enough in terms of storage to justify large-scale DAC facilities, direct air capture. So ex situ may works for more limited uses, but if you're looking at deploying direct air capture at the gigascale, as we're looking at, ex situ won't get you there. You need in situ.
Oh, very good. Three questions on the board now. Two for Mathieu. Lou Chab is asking about your test drilling project and how you plan to handle water footprint. You didn't mention anything about water.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think these are important questions. So in the first one, yes, we'll be the test well that we're proposing to build or to drill in October. So yes, we'll be taking cores and well logs. What's interesting, because this is an old mine site, we have access to these old cores and well logs going back. They literally found like old cores from samples from the late 1800s and early 20th century. So it's pretty neat for our geologists. But yes, absolutely, we will be doing this. We will be injecting very, very small amount of fluid, like a mixture of, again, of water and carbon to test the mineralization. And then that well will actually have a long-term use, is that it's going to become our observation well once we, so the well that we're drilling is not commercial scale, but it will be used in our longer term operations as an observation well once we start injecting at a commercial level. And then this ties it up with the other question about water. Yes, it is absolutely true. Huge, it's a big water footprint. We do need to mix large amount of water with the carbon to inject it and to mineralize it. Now, the techniques that our team of geologists is developing, we're hoping to have a better ratio than what Carbfix and 44.01 got in Iceland and Oman. So use about 2/3 the amount of the water that they're using. But also what they're designing is a water recycling method. So basically, once we get this in operation, it could become almost closed loop circuit, in the sense that we could recycle the water. Once the carbon has mineralized underground, we can pump it back up to the surface and then recycle it in the system, inject more carbon using that same water, so that your water footprint is minimal. And that's totally the goal, to make this work again at a large scale that we need.
Wow, very good. Well, we've got 3 minutes left. So Guillaume Durance, he's with Total Energies Research Director in Brazil, but he's asking about monitoring. Are you talking about monitoring the plume, or are you monitoring the pressure front? I don't think you can directly monitor pressure in a reservoir, but you're going to do the plume with seismic. And then Ahmed Shafin from Natural Resources Canada is asking if there's any updated assessments on aquifer storage. That might be easier to answer. Dwayne, maybe do you want to go for Ahmed's question? I mean, I think it's the last bit. Is there any updated assessments? You probably don't have time to read the whole thing.
Yeah, no, thanks. Is the short answer. There's definitely been some wells that have penetrated into this formation that we're looking, not a lot, but enough that we're cautiously optimistic, but you definitely there's a number of reservoir variabilities that need to be assessed to really update that estimate. But that's why the next step for us is to be drilling wells incrementally to gather this data, right? So we can do a more recent update.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, we've got 1 minute left. Mathieu, you didn't mention anything about finances. I don't know if you're not able to, or
about what? Sorry?
The money. What
Oh,
money do you
well,
have
the money.
coming in?
Well, just quickly answer. There's a question of mineralization.
Oh, right. Okay.
How do you avoid it near the wellbore? So there's casing, obviously, along the well, so that it doesn't happen. There's no, it's not an open well till you get to about 800 meters, and then just the pressure from the injection will push the water into the crevices. So we're not expecting, like, there shouldn't be a clog forming anywhere in the well or around the wellbore. Now on the financing, what exactly is the question?
Oh,
my question was what money comes in and what money goes out. I hear about these.
Oh yes, so I think I mentioned it very quickly, but yes, we're generating credits that we're selling on the voluntary markets. Now, obviously that's for now, and we're hoping that as the price of the cost of the technology goes down and the prices on the regulatory markets go up, they'll meet somewhere there in the middle, and this becomes a solution for more generalized carbon mitigation across the world, and dealing with the historical emissions, which, as you know, we've just emitted too much carbon already. So we need to go to net zero and then keep removing till we get to a point where it's comfortable for all of us.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, we're on the hour now, so that's the end of the webinar. So thank you very much, Mathieu, Mac, and Wayne. I think this conversation has moved along a lot from last year, where I remember it being far more about reasons we couldn't do it. At least we've come up with reasons we can and do it, along with a few reasons we can't do it. So hopefully we do it again next year and be even more positive. If there's any geologists watching, our next webinar is about UK oil and gas exploration. You can find out more on finallypetroleum.com. We'll put the video of this on YouTube. We'll send you the link so you can see a lot of the detail again. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll hopefully see you all again soon. Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.